Thank you so much, Julie. I told you to say something nice, but that was too much. And thank you, Dean, and thank you to the Clinton School for honoring me by inviting me here. And thank you, everybody, for coming, even though I'm not Dr. Phil. I've grown to love Little Rock in the few days I've been here. It's an amazing, warm, friendly place. When I got off the plane at the airport, I found 3 wonderful women, threw their arms around me and welcomed me. We got to the baggage rack, and there was a woman that they greeted, and I immediately tried to throw my arms around her. It turned out they were just being polite. This is true, right? I'd like to tell you a little about myself personally and my own journey to where I am today. And I'd like to talk a little politics and maybe a little religion, you know, the things that we all were told never to talk about in public. Let me start by telling you that I was born here in the United States. I won't tell you I come from New Jersey because that could be embarrassing. But I moved to Israel from the United States in 1966, a year before the fateful Six-Day War broke out in the Middle East. I was 20 years old, an Orthodox Jewish woman, and very passionate about Israel and the importance of having a Jewish state. I felt very strongly about this, having grown up in a family where both my parents escaped anti-Semitic Europe in the 1930s, but all their loved ones perished in the Holocaust. Well, I was studying at the university in Jerusalem, and the end of the school year in 1967 brought an unexpected and momentous event. That was the Six-Day War. What a shock for a young American to find herself in the midst of war, barely understanding what it was all about. But what I did understand was that the Jewish state was under threat of annihilation by the Arab countries surrounding us, and we cowered in fear in our dorm rooms as the tension rose and the nationalist belligerence mounted around us. Then the war broke out, and almost just as suddenly, it ended. Just 6 days later, and Israel had managed to wipe out someone's air force before it even had a chance to take off, and surround someone's army, and suddenly there was a huge national sigh of relief, immense release from fear that we were all about to get killed. I remember dancing in the street with my friends, kissing all the soldiers who returned from the front line. Well, maybe that wasn't related. And thrilling with the newscasters who reported heroic war stories. I even remember listening to the weather report when they gave the forecast for Jerusalem, and the weatherwoman called it the center of the country. Wow, that was us. Just a week earlier, we had been on the border, and now we were the center of the country. That was really the main result of the events of June 1967, that Jerusalem had become the center of the country, because Israel had conquered and occupied the entire tract of land to our east. That tract of land was the west bank of the Jordan River, and soon enough we were calling it in brief the West Bank. Israel had also conquered other tracts of land during this war. We had taken the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And that was a lot of land, much bigger than actually Israel alone originally was. And most of us thought, wow, this is a great opportunity. We've been waiting for peace, and now we've got a piece of property that belongs to someone else. This is a chance to barter that property for peace. We even had a popular song with the lyrics, Rabin is waiting for Nasser. Don't expect me to sing it. But the point was that General Yitzhak Rabin, who had led us to victory in the war, was waiting for a phone call from Nasser, then the president of Egypt, offering to deal if only he could get back the Sinai Peninsula with its oil fields. Well, that phone call did not come very fast, and meanwhile, the deeply religious segment of Israeli society was taking advantage of the opportunity to create facts on the ground, as they called it. They were moving out of Israel and into all of those conquered areas, the West Bank, the Gaza, Sinai, the Golan Heights, and establishing settlements, which they hoped would become permanent. Thousands of them were moving out there, and they looked to me an awful lot like the early pioneers who settled Israel in the early 1900s. I also joined them, for a weekend at least, just as a statement of intent that I would come back there and help them settle the land and be as much a pioneer as they were. But, well, on Sunday I went back to my dorm room and back to my studies in grad school. I did have a ways to go before I finished them. But as you know, life gets in the way of best laid plans. Before I knew it, I was married, I had 2 kids, a pretty good job, and I was mostly focused on getting my children to read and write English before the schools would corrupt them into studying and focusing on Hebrew. Somewhere along the line, I also shifted from orthodoxy into a less demanding kind of Judaism. My life was good, comfortable, very busy, and the Intifada broke out. The Inti what? I had never even heard that word before. Intifada, but experience is a good teacher. Intifada, uprising. The Palestinians were angry, demonstrating, sometimes rioting, had killed some Israeli soldiers, and would not be subdued by more troops coming to control the crowds. I was shocked by the level of violence, and I could not fathom what the problem might be. Wasn't our presence in the territories as benign an occupation as there ever had been? Hadn't our soldiers brought a better life to the inhabitants? Why were they so angry at us? My friend invited me to join a group of Israeli women that had just started to hold a weekly vigil. They were dressing in black as a sign of mourning for the victims of both sides, and she invited me to join them. I thought that costume was silly, and I went in my regular clothes that Friday. They held a sign that said, "End the occupation," and I wrote on a sign and held it up, and it said, "Stop the violence." As the killings surged in the territories, I continued to attend the vigil, always with my own sign deploring the violence and asking both sides to please, please, just be nice to each other. One week, Judy, someone who was on the vigil, someone I barely knew, invited me to dinner at her home. It was a wonderful dinner, good food, good wine. I had a fascinating conversation with the woman on my left about the good books we had read. And at some point I turned to her and I said, "Rita, where are you from?" "I'm from Ramallah," she said. "Oh no," I said. "I mean, before you moved to Ramallah." She said, "No, I'm Palestinian. I'm from Ramallah." I said, "That's impossible," without even thinking. "If you were Palestinian, you wouldn't be sitting here and talking to me now." "That's ridiculous yourself," she said. The Palestinian National Council just officially recognized Israel and wants a 2-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side. I heard this, but I couldn't believe it. "That's not true. If that were true," I said, "I would have heard it on the Israeli media." She said, "Well, you have a lot to learn. There's censorship on the Israeli media." Her words shocked me. I had not known about censorship. I left Rita, and that night began my education in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It turns out that there was a lot I had not known. Now, think about this. I was 42 years old before I met the first Palestinian for a real conversation. I mean, I had talked to Palestinians before, the gardeners and the shopkeepers on the other side of town and the cleaning ladies, but I'd never before spoken to a Palestinian who is like me, educated, well-traveled, liked books. That's because though Israel controlled the lives of Palestinians through the occupation, there is complete segregation between us. We don't go to the same schools, we don't meet at work, we don't eat at the same restaurants, and, well, we don't go to the same dinner parties. In fact, today, 20 years after that dinner, the segregation is much worse. Today, I would not be even allowed to enter Ramallah, and she would not be allowed to enter Jerusalem. This separation plays a big role in the stereotypes we have about each other, the fear and prejudice, my racist belief that an educated and cultured woman could not be Palestinian. A second thing I realized was the censorship. At the time I met Rita, Israeli radio news was ordered by the government never to mention the name PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, never to mention its leader, Yasser Arafat, in the belief that they were terrorists, and terrorists should not be given publicity. Therefore, when the Palestinian National Council voted in 1988 to declare a state and reject terrorism and implicitly recognize Israel's right to exist, we Israeli citizens were told nothing of it. Well, that dinner and conversation with Rita began my education, and from there I began to talk to Palestinians, even visit them in their homes, and try to understand what they were so angry about. I actually made a friend in Gaza in the years before the Gaza Strip was closed off to the entire world. My friend Inam is an English teacher, and she and her husband, also a teacher, were putting their children through universities, abroad of course, each one of them studying outside because there were no opportunities for study or work in Gaza. Today, Osama is a water engineer, Jalan is a trained diplomat, Jemana is a computer expert, Mona is a doctor, Lina is an accountant, and little Muhammad, now grown up, is actually an advertising man. Now, how much PR and advertising can you do in a war zone? Today, they all live abroad. I met Inam because her son, Usama, the water engineer, was arrested for writing political graffiti on the wall of his neighborhood. She called me up and asked me to find a lawyer for him. What did he write? I asked Inam in trepidation. He wrote, 2 states for 2 nations, she said. Well, he was put on trial and sentenced to and served 10 months in prison. Today, even our Prime Minister Netanyahu has been known to utter 2 states for 2 nations, or something close to that. This was my awakening, and soon I too was showing up at the Women in Black vigils, as they came to be known, now dressed in black and carrying a sign that said, "End the occupation." And I began to supplement my political education with political activism as well. After that initial shift in my perspective, realizing the occupation was morally wrong and taking a terrible toll on Palestinians, I had a second shift in my perspective a few years later. It began to dawn on me, or maybe someone dawned it on me, that the occupation was not only a terrible thing to be doing to the Palestinians, but also a terrible thing to be doing to Israel as well. When I think about the short 61-year history of Israel, I count 9 different wars or military operations, as the generals call them, as if they're operations to fix our health. Here's a quick listing. In 1956, the Suez Campaign against Egypt. In 1967, the Six-Day War against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War against Egypt and Syria. In 1982, the First Lebanon War, which lasted 17 years. In 1987 and 2000, the beginning of 2 intifadas, uprisings, which lasted several years. In between those intifadas, the first Gulf War, in which Iraq shot missiles at us, but our Prime Minister, thank goodness, had the good sense not to shoot back. In 2006, the second Lebanon War, and I hope we've stopped counting those wars. And finally, well, I hope finally, the Gaza War last December and January, when Israel responded to rockets thrown by Hamas. Wow, 9 operations, none of them medical, in just one lifetime. This is an incredible amount of warfare in a very short period. Now, regardless of who started those wars and whether they were in self-defense by Israel or not, and those are very important questions, let's just look at what happens to a country that is constantly under attack and trying to defend itself. It becomes very insecure. It becomes worried about its survival. and it gets very serious about its commitment to remain strong, to sharpen its military prowess. Believe me, survival becomes very important when you're under fire. But think of some of the effects that this has on a modern society. Boys dream about growing up to become fighter pilots rather than doctors. Young women are encouraged to have as many children as possible to fuel the demographic war, the race to have more Israeli children than Palestinian children. Domestic violence increases as soldiers unconsciously bring home aggressive modes of behavior from the battlefield into your home. And racism grows against Arab citizens of Israel. Arab citizens are 20% of the Israeli population, because some Jewish Israelis now think that all Arabs are the enemy. That's a very heavy price for a modern democratic state to pay. And there are more prices. The constant waging of war deepens poverty because our country sinks vast resources into weapons, maintaining the occupation, building settlements, all at the expense of social programs inside Israel: housing, education, health, programs for the elderly, and other needs. All these important social issues become marginalized when a society is at war. I know that some of you have also been thinking about that vis-a-vis the United States involvement abroad. Now, in Israel, the ongoing conflict also, and this might surprise you, the conflict heightens inequality between men and women. In a society at war, where it is predominantly the men who are risking their lives and making military and political decisions, men and their views become valued and privileged over women and our views. Does it surprise anyone that a man who has been an officer in the army or served in a combat role has an advantage over a woman in applying for a job? And let's not forget all the Israeli generals who parachuted directly out of the army into senior elective office, including several prime ministers: Yitzhak Rabin, Arik Sharon, Ehud Barak, all former chief of staff of Israel. What do they know about political activity? So as all this is happening around me, I was beginning to come to the conclusion that the time had come for me to stop working on other volunteer activities and start working on stopping the war and the bloodshed and trying to help Israel figure out how to get to peace. Fortunately, there were already many people in Israel working on the problem, and I joined them. We're not a large group, but we are diverse, loud, and if I may say so, also brave. There are groups whose names you probably don't know: Gush Shalom, Breaking Silence, Rabbis for Human Rights. Groups that work to end the Israeli occupation and build a culture of peace. Among the human rights organizations, I could mention B'Tselem, which seeks to protect the human rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories, or the Association of Civil Rights in Israel, which protects human rights of Israeli citizens. There's not time to talk about them all, but I would like to say a few words about the women's peace movement in Israel, which has been at the forefront of peacemaking. Now, I told you about Women in Black. We have maintained a 1-hour vigil every single Friday for the past 22 years, in which women hold signs demanding an end to the occupation. Women in Black now exist in many countries, and there was a wonderful Women in Black vigil just Saturday right here in Little Rock. In Israel, the women's peace movement also includes Bat Shalom, which engages in political dialogue with Palestinian women. It includes New Profile, women who support the 18-year-olds who are conscientious objectors to military service and are sent to prison. It includes Machsom Watch, women who stand at military checkpoints by 6 o'clock in the morning to make sure that Palestinians are allowed to cross despite the harsh restrictions. These and other groups, joined together in the Coalition of Women for Peace, work together to bring an end to the bloodshed. The women's organizations in the peace movement engage in a wide variety of activities We help Palestinians in the olive harvest every fall. We provide school supplies to Palestinian youngsters every September. We take fellow Israelis on tours of the occupied territories so they can see with their own eyes what the problems are. We run public education campaigns. We engage in Gandhi-inspired direct action. We once laid siege to the Israeli Ministry of Defense because we thought they just didn't understand what it feels like to have a siege put around you. And kind of surprised us, they had no sense of humor. We spent the night in jail, but I guess that's another story. We have blocked bulldozers with our bodies to prevent them from destroying Palestinian homes. We have chained ourselves to olive trees to prevent them from being uprooted. And we have confronted soldiers in efforts to prevent destruction and death. Much joint work has also been done together with Palestinian women. Some of our actions have ended in arrests or injury. If peace could be won by effort alone, the women's peace movement would have achieved it long ago. Let me also mention one more aspect of the women's peace movement. We advocate that women must be equal partners in negotiations for peace, giving full support to UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which mandates equality for women in all decision-making. Women must become part of the negotiations because this is only fair and just, and also because those agreements must reflect the needs of all people affected by them, not just men. Therefore, the input of women is critical. We also point out, and this won't surprise you, that women are probably more likely to come up with a peace agreement, one that is a win-win situation for both sides. It kind of defies logic, I must say, to appoint military men as negotiators, generals who are trained to measure their success by the unconditional surrender of the other. I believe that any mother would have more experience in the art of resolving conflict than any general. But the importance of the Israeli peace movement in general is not its courage in defying authority, but in holding up a vision that goes beyond the end of fighting. It is not only that we must break the cycle of violence, but that both sides must engage in a deep-seated change of priorities. This means not just ending the occupation, but celebrating the existence of both states, the state of Israel, safe, secure, and sovereign, side by side with the state of Palestine, safe, secure, and sovereign. It means not just ending the belligerence, but shaping a shared future of cooperation with our Arab neighbors. It means opposition to the militarism that permeates both Israel and Palestine. An equal role for women of both nations in the negotiation for peace, and a society that cares more about education, health, art, and the poor than it does about maintaining a deadly arsenal. It means a world in which we share our resources rather than fight about them. We in the Israeli peace movement call for an end to the occupation with its unremitting violence, some of it perpetrated by us, some of it perpetrated against us. We know that Israel can return to its original vision, the vision of the Declaration of Independence of Israel, that our country will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. Israelis and Palestinians have marched together under the banner, "We refuse to be enemies." Indeed, the Israeli and Palestinian peace movements have already made peace on paper, in our hearts, in the lessons we teach our children, in the behavior we model. We are allies for peace, united in our struggle against extremists and warmongers on both sides. We are fervent believers in the wise words of Benjamin Franklin, "There was never a good war or a bad peace. Israel has been a formidable opponent over 61 years of history. We've won many battles, but we have yet to claim victory, the victory of peace with our neighbors. This victory will come only when both sides turn away from the instruments of war, from educating its sons to become warriors, and instead turn toward crafting the principles of a viable peace, a peace that will allow both peoples to live and prosper. To accomplish this, it helps to have friends in the White House, but it is more important to have an Israeli prime minister and a Palestinian prime minister who are weary of war, inspired by peace, and willing to speak the truth to both nations, that only through dialogue and compromise can we end the bloodshed. Ending war in the Middle East may have a positive influence on ending the global rivalry between East and West. I don't know if peace in our tiny corner of the universe could have such a large impact, though it may be one element of it. But I do know that ending the occupation and making peace in the Middle East will not only be the liberation of Palestine, it will mean the liberation of Israel as well, liberating us to turn our creative energy into more constructive, life-sustaining projects. Imagine what that could mean. It's time to end the dynamic of war in Israel, in Palestine, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Sudan, in the Congo, wherever war is used as a strategy to resolve conflict. War destroys. It destroys its perpetrators just as surely as it destroys its victims. We can no longer afford the luxury of acting out of our basest instincts. Weapons are too powerful. Lives are too short. The time has come to hone the tools of peace, dialogue, solidarity, sharing. Our planet is fragile. Let us lay down our weapons and celebrate life. There will still be great challenges for the strong and the brave, but the cemeteries will have fewer graves of small children and their parents who could not protect them. War crushes our souls and robs us of our dreams. Let us save our souls and our dreams. Let us make peace. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged, we'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear. Any questions? Right here, Bob.
In your vision of a peace that's settled with the help, equal help of women, do you see a role for Hanan Ashrawi in this?
Hanan Ashrawi, who's who's probably the most senior Palestinian woman in the echelon of political leaders in Palestine, has been one of the most significant players in the women's peace movement in Palestine and partnered with Israeli women. She was one of the signees on the very first peace agreement signed between Palestinian and Israeli women. And that very first tenet of that peace agreement said, violence is not a strategy to achieve political ends. So I would love for her to be part of the negotiations.
Judge.
To what extent has the American political system hindered your effort?
Sorry?
What was that?
To what extent has the American political process and system hindered the peace effort?
Now, I don't want to be too hard on America, But giving one party to a conflict $4 billion of arms every year could not possibly be promoting peace. By the same token, let me say that I think the President of the United States right now is determined to see peace on his watch in the Middle East. And I'm very hopeful and support that. Not yet. Okay, not yet.
I want to let you know that you have been so inspirational and given me strength. Your talk last night. One of the things I think that I have been struggling with is that when we have intergenerational challenges, and each generation brings their own frame of experience to the struggle, they bring the fears of their unknown of their generation. And I think that's what's happening now with health. It's so intergenerational. What do you think that we can do that would help these many times 5 generations within a family or within a community that needs this kind of understanding, that each generation, for example, baby boomers need to understand senior citizens and their frame of reference, the X generation, all the many stereotypical identities we take on. How do we help each generation to be more tolerant of the frame of reference that's creating the fear of that generation?
I think that's the key question. And I think the key answer has to be education, not just in the schools. You can't leave it all for the schools. It has to be in the homes, in the churches, synagogues, and mosques. Educate, educate, educate. I think it's important also to be specific when you're educating. If all you say is love, tolerance, goodwill, I don't think you're going to get the kind of education that it takes. I think you have to name names. I think you have to say blacks are no less valuable and equal than whites. I think you have to say Arabs are no less valuable and equal than Israelis. I think these are all important statements that have to be made, and not in the abstract, but in the very specific.
Mahmoud, Dale.
Hello. My name is Mahmoud, and I'm a student here at the Clinton School. And now, when you talk about peace, I just wanted your opinion. When people come with bulldozers and just knock down houses, which is what's going on right now, setting up settlements in Arab neighborhoods, just setting up walls, not allowing Palestinian families to go just grab milk from the supermarket because Israeli soldiers have guns. How realistic is that? I mean, what kind of message are they trying to send, especially setting up the Knesset, which is an extremely right-wing government? And, how realistic is peace?
Peace is very realistic. Peace will come in my lifetime, not just in yours, young man. Peace is around the corner, but in order to get there, we have to change a little bit the configuration of political leaders. But it's going to happen. You can't prolong a 42-year occupation. It cannot go on forever. Tyranny ends. It always has ended throughout history, and this will come to an end. If you ask Israelis, do they want to end the occupation? 70% will tell you they do. If you ask them if they want a two-state solution, 70% will tell you they do. Of course, Palestinians also want it. 80% of Palestinians want a two-state solution, the state of Israel side by side with the state of Palestine. So now you've got enough good people who want to get to peace on both sides, and it's a matter of getting the political leaders to hear us. That's a wonderful question. Did everyone hear that? If that's so, why is there a right-wing government in Israel? A white-wing government. That's good. A right-wing government. And let me say, first of all, that the party that got the most votes in Israel was not the right-wing government that is now leading the coalition. The party that got the most votes was a compromise government, was a political party that wants to make compromise. But the head of that party could not form a coalition with others for all sorts of political intrigue reasons. She also didn't want to compromise with the religious. That was a very important part of it. One of the major political parties said, we will form a coalition with you if you agree never to give away any part of Jerusalem to the Palestinians. And she refused to sign, the head of that party. And she got the most number of votes, but she could not form a coalition with some of the other parties. And so we have now a right-wing plus extremist right-wing government in Israel. But we have the head of that government, Netanyahu, is actually someone who may serve the cause of peace very well. I know that may surprise some of you, but let me say that the good news about Prime Minister Netanyahu is that he doesn't have strong ideology one way or another. He's an opportunist. He will go with wherever the votes are going. You know, the joke we say in Israel is, why does Netanyahu have such a clean conscience? Answer, because he never uses it. So there is hope that a right-wing leader who starts to make peace and will lose the extreme right, that's part of his coalition, will be able to make up the slack from the centrist parties and will be able to make peace. It's not going to happen this month in New York, but it will take place over the next few years.
Bob, did you have one? Hold on, June.
How do you deal with people the likes of Ahmadinejad in Iran, who threatens Israel, who denies the Holocaust? And there are others, too, who do the same thing, Hamas in Gaza. How do you react to that?
I hate extremism. And how do I respond to Ahmadinejad in Iran and the Hamas in Gaza? I think that religious extremism is very, very dangerous, whether it's Muslim extremism or Jewish extremism or Christian extremism. And they're of great concern to me. I do think, though, that we have to figure out how to talk to all those people. And I'm in favor of speaking to Iran and dialogue with the Hamas. I think that through dialogue and through mutual interests, we will be able to come up with reasonable resolutions to our differences. And I'm completely opposed to bombing Iran, completely, if that wasn't clear.
Question from the Mount St. Mary's Academy student.
Hello, Ms. Svirsky. More power to you in your cause for peace. You mentioned United Nations Security Council Bill 1325 that, I'm sorry, I'm so nervous, that provides for equality for women in all decision making. What is its status right now in the Security Council? What is the likelihood of it being passed? And
It passed. Security Council Resolution 1325 passed.
And what does it encompass?
No, it passed, and every year there's an official meeting of the Security Council to reaffirm its commitment to equality for women. I once had the honor of being invited to address the Security Council about that, and I spoke to all those men, and they agreed.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
What are the main stumbling blocks to peace, and how could they be resolved?
What are the major stumbling blocks to peace? Okay, and how to resolve them? Okay, a little bit of a big question. I'm going to try to answer it in brief as I can. Will you hear me? Is this mic on? Okay, good. I'm going to write down what I think the main stumbling blocks are, and then we'll talk about how to resolve them. Refugees, I know I'm writing small, but let's talk next about Jerusalem. The third is the settlements. How did you know? Yeah. And who knows, who knows what the fourth one will be? That's right, water. You were at the church class. No, okay. Okay, oops, let's do it here. I'm going to draw a schematic view of Israel, just a little bit to give you a sense. Let's call this Israel, okay? On the right, on the right. I still talk right and left instead of east and west. Okay, on the left, on the east of Israel, west. On the west of Israel is the Mediterranean. Right up here is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia out here, Egypt down here, and out here we have Iraq and Iran. You know, nice neighborhood. Oops. Who's a tech person? Can you make that? Oh, good. I'll try not to write so hard. I get a little passionate about this. Okay, let's look at the issues. In 1948, when Israel got independence, took independence, 800,000 Palestinian refugees were forced to leave Israel. Now, some people say they ran away. Some people say they were forced to leave by Israel. Regardless of what made them go, the basic bottom line is that 800,000 left in 1948. They settled in Lebanon. Don't worry about it. I'll hold my finger here. They settled in Lebanon and Syria, Jordan, Egypt. They went to points west, and they went to Europe. They came to the United States. And today, those 800,000 have had children and children's children, and there's something like 3 million Palestinian refugees around the world, maybe even more. I mean, we obviously haven't taken a census of all of them. So we're talking about something like 3 million Palestinian refugees that Israel does not want to return to their country. What are you going to do about that? They're demanding the right of return, as international law grants them. The second problem is Jerusalem. When Israel, oh, I wish I had an eraser. I would put Jordan a little bit further over here. In 1967, how's red? Israel took over the territory called the West Bank and took over this little strip of land called Gaza. And guess what's right in the middle of both of these? Jerusalem. Jerusalem overlaps Israel and the West Bank. So what are you going to do about Jerusalem? Palestine wants it as the capital. Israel wants it as the capital. How do you resolve that problem? The third is settlements. Ever since 1967, Israel has been sending out into the West Bank settlements, some of them big, some of them small, Israelis who have set up shop on the other side to entrench their presence and prevent peace. What do you do now about close to 500,000 settlers? And the last problem is water. There's clearly not enough water for everyone in the Middle East. What do? Okay, let's start with refugees. I'm going to appeal to the time-honored tradition of the Middle East. It's called double talk. In the refugee issue, and I am now representing a point of view that has been discussed extensively by both Palestinians and Israelis, and represents a point of view that we feel in the peace movement we can live with on both sides. It says there are two tiers to the resolution. The first tier is declarative. We say there is a right of return for everyone. It's their God-given right, or the right by international law, legal instruments. They should be allowed to return to Israel, and they do have that right. The second tier, here's where the double talk comes in. The second tier is implementation. And you say Israel has the right to decide on the implementation of that right, on whether or not they will be allowed to return. And then, in fact, you have Israel agreeing to a smaller number of refugees than actually would want to come in, based on humanitarian reasons. I have an elderly grandmother who lives in Tel Aviv, and I I must be with her at the end of her days. And Israel will say, okay. And someone else will say, I once lived in this beautiful house in Jerusalem. It's no longer there, but I'd like to claim the property on which, the Hilton Hotel now stands. And Israel will say, no, sorry. Now, that's not where it ends. The resolution of the refugee problem would also have to give reparations to all of the refugees for their suffering of 60 years and now living in other countries. It would have to ensure that the states that have refugees living there would absorb them and give them full rights of citizenship and allow them to work, something that is not done today. And all of the refugees or their representatives would have to agree that we have now resolved the issue of refugees. It's not absolute justice. Absolute justice would be you allow 3 million refugees to join 7 million Israelis, and then you have a country that has in it people who are not so fond of that country, and Israel would feel very uncomfortable and feel very threatened. That would perhaps be the perfect justice system, but it just can't happen in a real world. The second issue, Jerusalem, is not as complex to resolve, in my opinion. In my opinion, you just say, share it. Get over this thing about having to control and dominate. Share it. Share it. The Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem would become capital of Israel. The Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem would become capital of Palestine. We would figure out, Jewish side would do the traffic lights and the cleaning of the streets, and the Palestinian side would do the paving of the roads and the garbage collection. And we together work on water supply and electricity. I mean, really, how much intelligence or creativity does it take to divide up the functions of a municipality? So we think that would work, and we'd be very happy to have Jerusalem as a symbol of both peoples and a new paradigm for running the world, sharing space. The third, settlements, and people also view that as an obstacle for peace that we can't get over, and it's not. This will also take compromise. About half of the settlers live in this area. Let's do this. About half of the settlers live in this area surrounding Jerusalem, about 200,000 of them. These settlers and settlements would become annexed to Israel. Israel would claim this territory for itself and would draw the border somewhere like this, so that wherever there's high density of settlements, they would become part of Israel. But hey, that wouldn't be fair to Palestinians without something in return. And so the Palestinians would get an equal amount of territory in a fair swap of one-to-one territory. Places in Israel would become part of the Palestinian state. Now, what about these settlements that are outside? Well, they will have to move back, honey. They will have to move back. There are precedents for that in the colonization by Europe of Africa, where settlers were just told, get out. You have 2 years to move, the Israeli government could say. In those 2 years, we will help you find jobs inside Israel. We will help you find new homes. We will work at, by the way, many of them already work inside Israel. That would not be hard for them. They would just be changing homes, not changing jobs. And the rest of them, Israel says, we will withdraw our army after 2 years. Withdraw it. And then, if you want to stay there, if you want to apply for citizenship in the state of Palestine, you're welcome to try that. But if you feel a little nervous not having an army protect you after all the brutal things you did to your neighbors, then maybe you'd like to come back home. We would welcome you. I'd be happy if they stayed, actually, but. And the last thing is water. There isn't enough water in the Middle East if you're going to fill up all your swimming pools, and private homes will have swimming pools, as currently exists in the West Bank, where there's a very major aquifer of water. So there would have to be a rational distribution of water. People who have their private swimming pools would have to stop doing that. We would have to learn how to rationally divide the water between Palestine and Israel. And what's missing, the deficit, the water deficit, would have to be made up for by desalination plants. It works. We already have desalination plants around here that's feeding all the agriculture in this area. We have a desalination plant down here, which is providing drinking water to everyone in this southern part of Israel. It works. It's expensive, but war is a whole lot more expensive in every way. Okay, that's my take on the 4 obstacles.
We have time. We have time for one more question. Did you say you had your hand up for a while?
I think I've gotten from what you said today, and I think what maybe you said last night, was that religious extremists from all sides are what are driving, sort of fueling the conflict in some ways. And I was wondering, how many Christian women do you have in your peace movement in Israel?
You know, numbers are not everything. You know, what about a soloist in an orchestra? That's only one person. Our women's peace movement is small, but over the years, the views of the peace movement, not just the women's peace movement, but the entire peace movement, those views have trickled down into Israeli society. 20 years ago, only 20% of Israelis thought a 2-state solution made sense. Today, 70% think it's viable. 20 years ago, 3% of Israelis said that Jerusalem could be a shared capital. Today, 20% say it could be a shared capital. Now, that's still a small number, 20%, but I'm sure that if the leaders came up with a reasonable solution, even the Labor Party, which is a member of the current right-wing government, even the Labor Party believes in sharing Jerusalem. So little by little, it's trickling down.